Several years ago, my youngest daughter, who lives in Paris, was attending Mass at the Church of Saint Eugène Saint Cécile, the diocesan traditional parish in Paris. One Sunday, a young man approached her after Mass, he introduced himself, and asked if she would go to lunch with him. She agreed. Later, when she was telling me about this event, I asked her how it went. She said, "Oh, Papa, it was awful. He spent the whole time just complaining about how everything went wrong after Vatican II." I replied, "I can see how miserable that must have been. It must have been like having a date with your father." She said, "Exactly." Well, we both chuckled, but there was a subtle message here. Those of us who lived through the council and its immediate aftermath experienced things, life in the church, in ways that our children, or in some cases, maybe our grandchildren, never experienced. The post-conciliar church is not a war zone for them. It's just natural. They have either been raised in the post-conciliar church, and it's what they know, that is, it's what's familiar to them, or in some cases, they've been raised in traditional communities, and they just attend the TLM because that's what their families do. And it too is not a war zone. This is especially true for the so-called Benedict babies, children who were born after Pope Benedict XVI liberated somewhat the TLM with his motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. For these younger Catholics, hearing the older generation rage about this cardinal's corruption or that pope's lack of charity, it just makes their eyes glaze. It means little or nothing to them personally. It does not help them figure out how to live moral, virtuous lives. Now, we older people may see that part of the challenge they face is they don't have a church giving them proper guidance toward moral, virtuous lives. But they don't see that, and we cannot tell them that because we would just sound like old people complaining because we're old and that's what old people do. Also, for the most part, the younger generation does not experience the horrendous outrages of our generation. They don't see the clown masses, the giant potato head masses, the dancing girls in the sanctuary masses that we did. Yes, they experience some serious liturgical abuses, for example, so-called gay pride masses, but overall the experience today is much less outrageous than it was in the immediate post-conciliar years. For the most part, things are much calmer, perhaps banal, but not shockingly offensive. Impoverished? Yes, but calmer. And impoverished in ways that just seem normal to the present generation. So what's the result of all this? Well, I've just spent a week with a group of young, devout Catholic musicians. Almost every one of them works in a Novus Ordo parish. Most of them have experienced a TLM occasionally, but it's a rare experience for them, rare enough that it does not really shape their spiritual life in any way. All of these students are committed to raising the musical standards of their parishes. They want better music and more reverence, more appropriate surroundings for the miracle of the Eucharist. Curiously, they do want to restore many items of tradition, more Latin, communion kneeling in on the tongue, fewer lay people in the sanctuary were a few things mentioned. But they don't long for a TLM. They're perfectly happy with a reverent Novus Ordo, with better music. Now, let's stop for a moment and ponder this concept of a reverent Novus Ordo. Suppose we had a Novus Ordo Missa that was entirely in Latin. The readings and the orations were chanted, the proper and ordinary chants were sung, the Mass was said ad orientem, the canon was used exclusively, the offertory and the canon were prayed silently, there were no lay people in the sanctuary, communion was distributed on the tongue to a kneeling faithful, and on and on and on. That is, everything that could be done to make the Novus Ordo seem like the TLM was done. Now, I realize this is hypothetical because no one would celebrate a Novus Ordo Mass like this, except perhaps the canons of St. John Cantius and maybe the parish of St. Agnes in St. Paul, Minnesota. But these are unique situations, and I'm not sure that even they chant the readings in Latin. Also, I'm not sure many bishops would allow it. But for the sake of discussion, let's imagine this situation, this reform of the reform. Would this be enough? Would this end the liturgy wars? I believe that most of these young musicians would be delighted with this scenario. Some of them, though, might think, it's just a little too traddy. Certainly some, if not many, of the parishioners would think this, which begs the question, just what is too traddy? What's too traditional? What is the point at which the Novus Ordo is just a little too much like the TLM to be the Novus Ordo? Well, I don't know the answer to this question, but I do know that just to ask the question accepts implicitly that there is something fundamentally different between the two masses, even if it's hard for most people to articulate. If it's possible for the Novus Ordo to be too much like the TLM, that implies that there is something fundamentally different about the Novus Ordo that making it too much like the TLM would threaten. We might also ask, if we were to reform the Novus Ordo to this point, well, why not just go back to the TLM? Well, we cannot just go back to the TLM because, as I've just implied, the TLM and the Novus Ordo embrace fundamentally different theologies. And the accidents, or the aesthetics, if you want to use that term, have to be shaped in ways to point to those fundamentally different realities. We can dress up the Novus Ordo to make it seem a little more traditional, a little more Catholic, if you will, but we cannot go back to the TLM without changing the theology of the new Mass. This is at the heart of the liturgy wars. If the whole matter were just about aesthetics, we would not be having the battles we're having. The battles, by the way, in which the younger generation is just not interested. These battles are not their battles. So let's return to my main thesis. We have younger generations who are devout, who want nothing more than to live moral, virtuous lives, but who have to struggle to do this with a Mass and sacramental architecture that has been impoverished. It's like they're trying to build a house, but their drills have no bits. The teeth on their saws are dull, and they have only flathead screwdrivers. They might get the job done, but it's a lot harder. And worse, they don't know what it's like to have drill bits, sharp saw blades, and Phillips head screwdrivers. They just don't know. Now, you might be thinking, Ed, it's hard even when you have all the tools. And if you're thinking that, you're correct. Living a moral life is hard, even when we have the fullness of the faith. So it's imperative that we give the coming generations every tool we can give them. But how? That's the question. How do we guide a younger generation to the traditions that will give them greater assistance in their struggles to live moral, virtuous lives? What's clear to me is that we cannot do it by complaining. The younger generation will simply say, your war is not my war. In fact, I'm not sure how much the generation wants to hear from the older generation at all, complaining or not. This is a task that the younger generation must take on. So I'm seeking a younger person or persons, I don't exactly know the age, 20s, early 30s, who would like to tell the story. What tradition is, in your perspective, what it means to you, why it's important for you and for the life of the church, especially for people your age. Maybe it's a one-time interview, but maybe it's a new show, a not boomers church show. Maybe it's one person or maybe it's a team. I'm happy to provide assistance, guidance, whatever it will take to help this be successful. So if you are interested, contact me. Or if you know someone or some persons who would be good candidate or candidates for this, have that person or those persons contact me. My war may not be your war, but the battle is real nonetheless. So I'm asking you to step up and shape a message that will help your generation fight the good fight as you see it, so that, as St. Paul puts it, you may reap the crown of justice that is laid up for you. Truly, I hope to hear from you soon.